agenda continuously forward by establishing, slowly, annually, by stealth, the bureaucratic structures and power base and wealth base through preemptive taxation over individual nations that will enable them increasingly to function as a global government in the way that the EU is now the supreme government of Europe, to the absolute fury and hatred of people like me who have to live under this effective dictatorship. And the way they're going to do it, because you asked what is their plan, how are they going to unfold this? Well, it's already evident in the draft conclusions of the conference, which already I've got hold of them, that they are intending to follow the same sort of thing as the EU did and also as the UN did with the climate thing, where you gradually set up more and more bureaucracies. You know, this conference calls for the UN to do this, do that, do the other, and the UN then sets up a bureaucracy to do it, saying, well, we were told to do it by this agreement or that international meeting or whatever. They can always justify where they were told to do it. But in effect, what they're doing is expanding their power base and then sending the bill to governments and saying, well, you had this meeting, you signed this document, now you've got to pay.
I don't know if it's the appropriate metaphor, but it makes me think of throwing a stone into a pond, and a small circle gets bigger until it's surrounding the whole area they want to conquer.
That's exactly what happens, and they want to expand the center to the point where it becomes so well-funded, so many top people go there, that governments anywhere else can no longer compete. That's what we have in Europe. You have the European dictatorship, where all the best people who want to go into government, they don't go into parliament. What would be the point? You can go into parliament, you can vote for what you like. Makes absolutely no difference, because the real power, and 5/6 of all our laws, are made by people we don't elect somewhere else. So the people, the real power-hungry folk now, they don't go into parliament. And so Parliament becomes weaker because the people with real ambition don't go there. They go instead into this cloying bureaucracy in Brussels. And the UN is now expanding in the same way. They are multiplying agencies in the same way that Brussels did. You know, the UN High Commission for Refugees, the UN Children's Fund, the UN Environment Programme, and they're all multiplying, more and more of them. Every time I go to one of these UN conferences, there's another 3 or 4. There are now something like 150 individual UN agencies, each separately funded by the taxpayers, in states who have no control over how much money is spent or how much of their money is taken from their pockets to pay for the UN. It's all not transparent at all. It's all completely secret. It's the very antithesis of what was intended in this constitution, where government had to be visible to the people. It was in Britain that the idea of recording the proceedings of Parliament first came about, with Hansard producing a daily record of what was said. And this happens, of course, in your Congress now. There's a congressional record of what was said. And if you testify in front of a congressional committee, your remarks are read into the record, and any documents you submit are written into the record, and anybody can look and see whether what you said was sensible or not. But in the EU, the commissars meet behind closed doors. If they decide on a law, that then gets passed to another committee called the Committee of Permanent Representatives, which fleshes it out and does the detailed work. That's behind closed doors too. Then it goes to the Council of Ministers. They meet behind closed doors. And then and only then, if all of those 3 have said yes, it goes to the European Parliament, which is elected but has no power. It's just a ceremonial, as Alex Jones calls it. It's just decoration. And they, even if they vote it down, the commissars can reintroduce it either via the same process again until the Parliament gives in, which they've done on many occasions, or simply directly, as what's called a Commission regulation, bypassing the elected Parliament altogether, and indeed all the elected parliaments of Europe altogether. We are now, in a formal sense, a dictatorship, and it's very unpleasant to live under it, because all the bureaucrats then start behaving like dictators. And they hate me because I stand up and I name them on the air and I give them a lot of trouble. But the important point here is the UN would now like to copy the success of the EU in growing these gargantuan, completely useless and very damaging and stifling bureaucracies, so that it can have world domination. Can you imagine the right to levy taxation on the whole globe? This is going to give enormous power and wealth to the centre. And it is absolutely unthinkable to me, having been brought up in a democratic tradition which we have now lost, to see that you and the rest of the world might lose this too, via these climate conferences. And the way they do it is the climate conferences are every year. The negotiators all go to some place where there are plenty of grass skirts and nice sun, sea and sand, so they get a bit of a holiday. Therefore, they don't read the documents put in front of them. They just agree to them for the sake of going home and saying, yes, we have an agreement. And these agreements are cumulative. They pile up one after the other. Real power, real wealth being transferred from individual states year by year with each annual new agreement to the center. It's never the other way. And the same now with the Rio +20 conference. One of the things they haven't yet written into the draft, but I know they're going to, is we can no longer afford, for the sake of the planet, to have these meetings every 20 years. We must have annual meetings. No. To carry this process forward and save the planet. You can hear the rhetoric now, and I'll bet you any amount of money you like. You won't find it in the draft now, but I'll bet you that that will be proposed. It's already been planned, I'm quite sure. And they will then say we must have annual conferences on sustainable development. And each of those annual conferences will have to have that same annual agreement or treaty at the end of it, which will transfer power, always more power, from us to them, never, ever the other way. It's been the same in Europe. It's been the same with the climate treaties. Now they're going to do the same with Agenda 21. They've learned how to do this now.
Now, so you already underscored the eugenics behind all this, that they want to reduce the world population almost all the way, 90+% basically.
They want to take 6/7 of it away.
But
yes.
This is getting quite deadly, these agreements. Of course, we remember Copenhagen. It was rejected by the developing world because they realized how much this is going to cost them in money, but also in livelihood. And this is getting worse and worse because we see United Nations groups pushing entire tribes, entire villages off the land in the name of fighting climate change, killing people even, showing up with armed weapons and so forth.
This has happened in Uganda, it's happened in Honduras, heaven knows how many other places it's happened, because our news media are not very good at covering countries where it's uncomfortable and there are no five-star hotels and minibars. They don't like to go to places like Honduras or Uganda because it's not comfortable there. It's not smart to go there. And so a lot of these things are happening around the world and are not being reported in the West. I mean, to give you one example of this, if you go back a few years to these various attempts to mess around with the climate, one of the things they did was to say we must take lots of agricultural land out of production for the sake of growing biofuels. And they took millions of acres of agricultural land out of
totally genocidal.
Growing food for people who need it and growing biofuels instead for clunkers that didn't. And the effect of that was to cause, or at least contribute to, the doubling of world food prices that happened in just a few years. This caused riots in a dozen regions of the world. Virtually none of these riots was reported. Food riots. People starve and they will riot because they're desperate to get food. You only have a food riot if there's real starvation. It doesn't happen otherwise. Food riots in a dozen regions of the world, all happening at the same time, all for essentially the same reason, that biofuels were squeezing out normal food production. And if in a fairly well-balanced market, which the food market was until that time, you suddenly take out a chunk, even quite a small chunk, though it was many tens of millions of acres of agricultural land, that will be enough to trigger a huge increase in the price of the raw commodities that are produced by farming. And so it's, you know, people sometimes naively say, oh, but, you know, you'd have had to take out half the agricultural land in order to double the food prices. No, it doesn't work like that, as you know. Once you put the pressure on prices, up they go. And that's what happened. This meant that people were starving all over the world, rioting because they were starving. The Western press hardly mentioned it at all. They're not interested. Yesterday, at the Heartland Conference, I said, look, instead of spending all this money on sustainable development and climate change and so on, all of which are completely wasted, it only cost $8 to save the life of a victim of trichiasis, which is a disease caused by the trachoma parasite, which gets into the eye and it causes the eyelashes to grow inward and pierce the eyeball. You eventually go blind. And it's one of the most acutely painful conditions known to man. Of course, you end up blind of it. And this can be cured for $8 by a simple existing operation. And I mentioned this yesterday, and I said there would be a far better use than these $80 billion that the US alone has spent on climate change and environmental this and that over the last few years. There you could do some real good, because is not man part of the environment too? If people are going blind because they're being attacked by a parasite in countries too poor to provide the elementary medication necessary, shouldn't we help them with that? Wouldn't that be a sensible, proportionate Agenda 21 to pursue? And here is how the left are already reporting what I said. They said, I'm claiming that I can personally cure these people of their blindness for $8.
But there's many diseases they know they could address.
And that here I am making stuff up. This is the line that they're totally unprincipled. They don't mind how many people they kill, because for them, if you kill people or they go blind or whatever and they can't be economically productive, then that will be good for the planet, because they see man as a parasite upon the planet, as harmful to the planet. They have these very, very extreme views, which they don't really believe, but they will recite them because what they really want is absolute global domination, and this is simply the pretext.
Let me ask you this, too, about the developing world. We know there's been problems with IMF and World Bank conditional loans. In some cases, they've actually tied population reduction to World Bank loans and other United Nations stuff. Aren't the actual aid packages out of these UN conferences also going to be a similar kind of problem, where their vision of development is reducing population, and for these third world countries to get this aid money, they've got to go along with these policies?
This is very true. For many, many decades now, the British government has had a policy that unless you have a population program, by which they mean a depopulation program by enforced artificial contraception or abortion, or both, then you cannot receive British aid. And this is not really known about in Parliament. If it knew about it, even nowadays, I fear they wouldn't do anything about it. But that's what the bureaucrats do. They say, unless you have a depopulation program, we won't give you any aid. And so this, in effect, forces contraception and abortion on countries, say, in Africa or South America, where both of these things are actually alien to their religion and alien to their culture. It's not the way they do things. But increasingly, the aggressiveness, the aggressive anti-humanness of this wretched extreme left faction is saying, well, we must do down the world's population, and because the poorer countries of Africa, they have no vote, they don't have proper democracy, they don't have a voice, these people, we can send in the UN troops and shoot them dead and take their land in the name of making it into a carbon sink and kicking them all off it. And nobody will really know or care very much, because these are little people that really ought not to exist in the first place. It's this contempt, racialistic in the worst sense.
Oh, absolutely.
For those who are poorer than they and who don't have a voice or a vote. And so the thing I would say is those who are listening to this who do have a voice and a vote, use the voice loudly and the vote carefully, and make absolutely sure that you do not vote for candidates of whatever party who do not understand the dangers that now exist in transferring power from elected hands here to unelected hands somewhere else. The correct approach is to say that before any more agreements are signed at any international conference, whether on the climate or sustainable development and these new annual conferences on that subject, which I'm quite sure are going to emerge from Rio, no more of these treaties should be signed unless and until the bodies exercising the governing power globally under these treaties have been elected.
Lord Monckton, we want to make sure we're fighting back against these conferences. Tell us one more time when Rio's coming up and the next climate conference. Tell us your website and where we can find your statements and ways to fight back.
Certainly. Well, first of all, scienceandpublicpolicy.org. You'll find a lot about the climate written by me there. Click on Monckton Papers when you get to the homepage. And for another climate website, whatsupwiththat.com, W-A-T-T-S, whatsupwiththat.com, run by Anthony Watts, a formidable meteorologist who has exposed the corruption in the temperature monitoring stations in the US and elsewhere, and has this blog, which now gets, I think, 100,000 or 200,000 hits a month. I mean, it's very, very big in telling people the other side of the story on these climate and environmental matters, and I contribute to that quite regularly too, so you'll certainly be able to use that. And as to Rio, it's coming up in mid-June. There'll be three days, roughly speaking. The 19th to the 21st of June is the culmination of a couple of weeks of messing about. I'll be going just for the last 3 days so that we have a presence